just introduce yourself and tell us more about your SG Eco-Fund project.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Carolin and I'm the founder of Susgain. We are actually a B Corp and RACE certified social enterprise, and our work is around driving sustainable behavior change through a gamified rewards app. So why this topic? Essentially, what we see is that in terms of sustainability, our awareness in Singapore and actually globally is increasing. I think by now almost everybody has heard about melting ice caps, about all of the like pollution in the ocean, all of the environmental issues that we face. At the same time, it doesn't automatically translate into action. So we feel we need to reduce that intention action gap that we see. And we do this through various community projects, working together with corporates, working with schools, and also working with event organizers to bring sustainability and sustainable action into these spaces. And when I think last 2 years ago, the OCBC index came out, we actually looked at the numbers and we were very shocked to see that this attention action gap is actually the highest amongst Gen Zs. So while the younger generation is actually the most aware, they also are the ones least ready to take action. And this really shocked us because I was always under the impression that the young ones will save us, but then there we see on the numbers that is potentially not the case. And so we said, what can we do about it? And so we applied for the SG Eco-Fund to look specifically at how can we engage different Gen Z communities to drive sustainable action through our engagement app. And so we are doing a project with a local primary school, a secondary school, and a polytechnic, and basically try to take this as a case study to better understand how can we best engage them on sustainable action. Thanks.
Thanks, Caroline. Hi, I'm Thammika Songkaeo. It's a Thai name, I'm Thai, but I've been living in Singapore for almost 10 years now. I recognize some faces from last year, actually. So I am the founder and director of Two Glasses, which tackles various environmental issues in multidisciplinary ways. So currently I am a National Geographic explorer, and what that means is I get money from National Geographic to make a film. That film examines the relationship between how we feel about our body and climate change. Essentially, it's a film about fast fashion. So what we do with the Eco-Fund is we work with the Eco-Fund money to screen that movie as part of kicking off a community of about 400 people who commit to buying less fashion items, less garments. I don't know if you all know, but 7 years ago, which is the latest data that we have, Singaporeans bought on average 34 garments a year and threw away 27. And that's before giants like Shein came. So nowadays it's a lot more than 34 and 27. So what we do with Eco-Fund money is we kick off this community and we work with the community for a whole year to prevent 6,800 garments from being bought, because being bought means going to landfill ultimately. That's what we do.
So, hi, my name is Jayden. I'm the co-founder of Soil Social. So what we do as a startup is we actually turn the different types of urban waste in Singapore, ranging from horticulture waste, agriculture waste, and also commercial food waste into high quality compost. Yeah, so I think some of you all here who knows what is compost can raise your hand so that I can understand. Okay, so actually a lot of you all know, but how do I say? So there's also a group of people in Singapore who probably doesn't really know what it is. So something that we identify as we actually progress the business is that some people don't really understand what it is, and they might not value their food waste. You know, they don't really see it as a resource, but they see it as okay lah, just throw away, no use anymore, right? So basically, what we wanted to do was to educate the common man about composting and also compost. And sometimes it's quite a big ask, right? To ask them to, hey, can you segregate your food waste? Can you take out the sticker? Then, you know, maybe garlic and chili don't put in because antimicrobial, right? Then they're like, wow, I want to do environmental good, but then it's like so troublesome. I still have to, you know, sometimes put in the freezer when, let's say I'm going to donate to a community farm. Like next week, I have to put in the freezer. So they there's so many barriers sometimes for those people who might not be the most aware, or they might not be, already engaging in this behavioral, behaviors. So what we wanted to do was to kind of like design the incentive. So we came out with this project called Ways to Wonder. So we actually launched it the first time at the Seletar Aerospace community. So we worked with JTC, us, and also asked the whole neighborhood, like all the different aerospace engineering companies, to tell their staff, hey, bring your waste over, and then we will exchange for compost or plants. So, but then the thing is, because we are all the way there, and sometimes during lunchtime people are not so keen to come down. So we decided that with that first experience, it was not bad. We engaged around 20 to 30 people, and they brought down their food waste for exchange, and we also brought them for a tour, explain about gardening, composting. But what we hope to do when we applied for the SG Eco Fund is to really bring it to the heartlands, right? And it's so heartening because we realized that actually some of them already are engaging in such a practice, and then a lot of them are curious and then they want to do more. So basically we hope that with SG Eco Fund we are able to incentivize, build in that incentive for people to change their behavior, to actually segregate and contribute their food waste, and then see it as a resource rather than waste. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all of you. So I think one key theme that I pulled out from each of your projects was, Carolin, you mentioned this intention-action gap, right? And there's a lot of barriers that we have to deal with when we're trying to change behaviors or to adopt sustainable lifestyles. So that's kind of my first question I want to dive into is, how do you design your project in a way that overcomes these barriers and helps you to gear people towards environmental action? We can round robin. The next question someone else will go first.
All right. So I think the first thing that we thought about is like, what is actually the definition of sustainability, and what does it actually mean? And when you talk to many different people, if I ask everyone in the room today, everybody would have a different definition of that. And by right, so right. And because it's basically so abstract, we sometimes don't know what are we supposed to do now, and that actually is a big hindrance. And so what we thought is we need to break this concept down, and our kind of simplified version was to say, why don't we, instead of talking about just sustainability, we talk about things you can do to reduce waste and pollution, or things you can do to lower your carbon footprint, or things you can do to do good for yourself or for the community. And so then suddenly, and essentially this is the definition of sustainability, it becomes already much more approachable. You can kind of relate to this much more. But then we kind of looked at how can we break this down even more, and what does maybe reducing waste and pollution actually means, right? And then you can look into what can I do to reduce, to reuse, to recycle. And when you break this down further, then you come to many little different individual actions that you can take. And so we strongly believe is that the beginning of your journey is actually looking at very small little things that you can do, that you can adopt in your daily life, and try to see how can you consistently practice these habits so that over time it helps you to change your behaviors. And then it's like a tree, right? So these individual actions link back to a certain habit, the habit links back to a certain sustainability cause, and that again links back to making everything more sustainable, right? And so essentially when we designed the app, we kind of looked into that and how can we first of all, in terms of the terminology, make it more accessible. And then I'm sure we're going to speak about this maybe later on more, but also how can we use other incentives such as gamification, social proof, points, rewards, community, make it more accessible and more fun for people to get started. The others share it more first.
I think your question is how do we plan for action, is that right?
Yeah, so like, or how do we overcome the barriers that stop us from getting to action?
Okay, there are two layers to be taken very seriously when I answer this question. The first one is whatever action you're going to ultimately advocate for has to be the right action that you advocate for. So I'll give you an example. I currently work in textile waste. what might come off someone's mind about how to deal with textile waste is to say, donate it. Let's put donation boxes all around Singapore. And most people will fall for that and think that's right. I need to go and do the work, and I do the work of investigating what happens to donations. And I know for a fact that Salvation Army, for instance, throws away 90% of the donations it receives. Yeah? It's on CNA, Salvation Army admits it, etc., etc. When I'm standing here talking to you, I cannot say loudly enough, go and figure out the right action before you advocate for anything. Go and do the investigative journalism. Write to journalists who have wrote about it, follow up, dig. I've written to journalists who have not written back to me because they didn't have the answer. So I went and I figured it out on my own. But do that work because it's very important. Because for instance, if I take the wrong action and I write to EcoFund and I say, I'm gonna put up donation bins for clothing. EcoFund itself has the bureaucratic expertise, but it does not have the subject matter expertise necessarily. It's our job to figure that out for ourselves, okay? So A, pick the right action. The way you can pick the right action is also by talking to people in the ecosystem. I know a lot about textile waste, but I don't know too much about ocean pollution right now, but actually those two are really linked. So when I choose whatever the right action is, or I think I'm getting to the right action, I need to go and talk to everybody who is in the ecosystem, who I don't yet see the link with, but I'm out there to figure out what the link is, because what I do not want to do is advocate for an action that I think is right, but end up jeopardizing someone else's work. So I'll give you an example. If there are people who really do not want to see plastic bags anymore in the world, they might, as step one of their thinking, say, well, let's advocate for cotton canvas bags. One cotton canvas bag probably costs 3,000 liters of water to make, among other environmental degradation things to think about. Ideally, what would happen in that situation is someone would approach someone else working in the space, textile space, and ask, hey, is it the right thing for me to do if I want to eradicate plastic bags to supply cotton bags? So when I say pick the right action, it's to just do the investigative work and talk to everyone else, even if you don't think there's a link. Because really, what we do not want in this space is for me to make progress, but it jeopardizes Carolin's progress, it jeopardizes Jayden's progress. That's not any real progress. You're basically just keeping yourselves employed. It's different. So after that, okay, so you pick the right action after all the work you've done. Then the next thing you need to know is behavioral science. And I think everybody in this room can go and have fun with all the behavioral science articles out there. They're so much fun to read. So if you know behavioral science, you know there are two things that really contribute to climate action. The first one is financial incentives, but the more powerful one is peer pressure. So what you need to form are communities of people who hold each other accountable. Whatever you're going to design today or in the future, try as much as possible for it to be at least pair work or triplets work, something like that, so these groups of people can keep each other accountable. So that's my answer.
I really love your answer. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So for Soil Social's case, where we try to design incentive to lower the barriers to action, right? That's the question. So basically, we know that sometimes the people who are already composting, they are already very passionate. But then if let's say people who are not so passionate, how do we actually engage them? So I like what you say about financial rewards. So in a way for them to receive compost that would otherwise they have to pay for it, because we sell one bag for like 2.5 liters, we sell it for $10 plus. But immediately, because there's it's actually funded by SG Eco-Fund, they are able to actually see this immediate reward for something that is waste. But of course, that's a very, short-term kind of solution, right? But you want to kind of like draw people in and see, oh, actually there's a value, there is nutrients that is still stored in this food waste, that's why they are giving me something back for this precious resource that I have. So basically coming out with a very obvious incentive for the beginning. But after that, of course, comes education and also like longer term kind of commitment. So some of them, they are actually quite interested in composting education. So the saying of like you teach them how to fish, they know how to fish for themselves for the whole life. So when we actually offer this composting education, we're also mindful that because sometimes we use like plastic for this composter, but the thing is, how do I say? So basically, we make sure that a lot of households, when they say, "Wow, composting is super smelly," there's a lot of pests and all that stuff, right? So we take into account all these potential pitfalls, and then we create this community whereby they can actually share. And also with our system, we make sure that we keep all the pests away. We make sure that the system does not smell. So we actually then change people's mind that, oh, actually composting at home can be easy, right? When we actually adapt the solution to Singapore, because sometimes it's so hot in Singapore, there's more pest pressure in Singapore as compared to temperate climate, for example. So basically we lower the barriers to entry for them to kickstart, and of course the whole idea of a community to keep each other accountable, right? How is your compost system going? And then each one of us, right, we will kind of like show some of the problems that we face with our composter, and maybe some of them show how they are using it. So in the end, it could be some sort of continuous citizen science, and also this community action that we hope to kind of like first seed, but as like kind of like a guide to actually guide them through this whole sustainability journey. And of course, with more and more people coming, then there will be more peer pressure, be like, oh, you don't compost your waste, that's kind of weird, So hopefully that's the kind of like behavioral change that we will see, like, of course not in the maybe next 1-2 years, but hopefully in the next 5 to 10 years, especially, with education of the younger, like Gen Zs and even younger, like, they will actually tell their parents, hey, this is not right, like, you're not composting your food waste. Yeah, so we hope to actually see that change with little small projects like this popping up.
Great. Wow. I'm like speechless. there was so, I don't know if you guys heard, there was so many amazing nuggets in what they shared. I'm going to try and summarize just to recap so that as you are thinking later about your own projects, you can try and insert some of these nuggets of wisdom in as well. So I think one of the key pieces that I heard was making sustainability, which is a very abstract concept, making it relatable, breaking it down into simple actions that you could do in your daily life, and then using those individual actions, getting it to be done enough to a point that it becomes a habit. And then Thammika added on very nicely about picking the right actions, right? And I mean, I don't want to scare people away and say that, you have to like really go through all the literature just to find the right one. I don't think you need to reinvent the wheel. Oftentimes, speaking to people who have already done this is the easiest and fastest way to figure out what are the right actions to do. So don't feel like you're in this by yourself. There are often people who have already done the work. You can build off each other and take what's been tried and tested. So some of the things they've shared are already some of the tried and tested ways you can just adapt it for your own communities. And then incentives was another theme that came out quite strongly, be it financial or otherwise. You can think about what are incentives for your communities. Sometimes it's not always a financial incentive. Sometimes community itself is the incentive, right? And that was the other theme that came out quite strongly, was the idea of like when people come together, you can do more, but also like it motivates each other to want to do more, either because of peer pressure, which I think is what Thammika said, also sometimes because people just want to find something to do with other people and work towards a goal together. In a world that's so busy, chaotic right now, we just want to be able to connect with people, and I think using sustainability as a focal point to be able to connect with your own community, right? I think a lot of you work with your communities in non-sustainability related sectors. And so then how can you use sustainability as another way to bring your communities together? And that's, I think, coming back to making it relatable to your audiences, right? So maybe your audiences don't necessarily buy into sustainability, but that's okay. You can treat sustainability as like a nice fun programming, but you get them socialized into it, and slowly they see the need for it. Through these small individual actions, they feel empowered, right? And I think the underlying message behind all of this is the empowerment piece, is making sure people feel like they are part of it, and they're not just, okay, someone tell me to do this, so I go and do that. actually, like, I can contribute to the problem. Yeah. So lots of like great nuggets that you shared. So thank you so much. So now that was I think you shared kind of the glorious side of like, wow, all these ideas and ways to go about doing it. Now I'm gonna flip the question on its head, right? It's always like, okay, these are the wins. What has not worked? Or what were some of the challenges that you faced in trying to do some of these things?
So that we are equal, we don't have to stress you all the time. Yeah, so that's a great question actually. Actually, to be honest, this is my second eco fund. The first one was actually about bringing. It's more on education, I think, to really raise the awareness of like seeds and how we should save seeds and actually seeds. And then this is the second one. I think the difficulty that I faced was actually together with my co-founder. We are actually working with one of the community centers in Singapore and also some of the grassroots volunteers. So we were tapping onto like this program that they are running called the Green Market, where they actually gather all their residents to come and then buy produce and all that. So actually the timing matters a lot because we thought that hey, we can actually write on their monthly or once every 2 months kind of like event, and then from there we can actually do all our community involvement. But what we didn't realize was when we actually began the conversation with them to plan for this event, it was actually the Chinese New Year period. So basically they were not doing much until all the way until like April and May. So in the end, I think timeline is important, and also understanding the bandwidth of your stakeholders. So let's say you also need to make sure that they are free to kind of work on this, and also riding onto their existing kind of events so that you are not making them work extra hard to push for your events, and you actually synergize and get more traffic. Yeah, so and another thing was actually getting volunteers. So we actually spoke to Ngee Poly, and we want to work with their, I think, civic learning kind of department and get their students to volunteer. But actually what they told me was that it's very hard to get students volunteer, but how we got around it was actually to work with all these lecturers to bake it into their module. So for example, their horticulture students are actually helping me to conduct some of our, to facilitate the workshop that we are launching, and also some of their biostatistics students, they're actually helping us to collect survey, like to do survey door to door actually. This was something that I did not see that is possible, because door to door knocking to share the event and to give them like composting boxes, it could be something that requires some labor. Yeah, so basically, think about how you can actually work with your partners so that it works in their favor and also works on their existing program. Yeah.
For me, I'll do what Jayden said, which is hinted at, which is also just admit where I am in the stage. So right now, I am still in the production phase. I've not completed my EcoFund grant, so I don't think I can honestly speak about what has not worked for this project specifically. But what I can talk about is, in general, what I know does not work in sustainability projects for me, from my own experience. From my own experience, what does not work is when I brand something as sustainability outright. But I have to caveat that by saying that's because my goal is I want to enlarge the amount of people who are participating in sustainability related things, in particular textile waste related things. If I brand whatever I do as textile waste, what ends up or will end up happening is I will get the 20 people in Singapore who are already in this space, and I'll just basically be taking them from my friends' events to mine. I cannot pat myself on the back at the end of the day. I know who I am, and I'm not going to make work like that. And I'm very clear about that. What I set out to do is get more people involved. So for me, what will not work is if I brand something as textile waste, sustainability, come, okay? So what I have to do is I brand it as a whole different subset, which is I go with body image issues. And then I tie body image in with how we consume fashion. I'm still doing what I set out to do, which is lessen textile waste. And I still get my new people in, and I know my goals, so that's how I do it. So personally, I don't like to brand things as sustainability, because it doesn't work for what I set out to do.
So I think again a very interesting sharing. What resonated with me a lot was the creating win-wins, and then also this, like how do you coin it and how do you find your audience? And I guess for us, the learning also not directly related to the EcoFund, but for our journey as Susgain is that from our mission has always been the same from day one. So we started in 2020 during the pandemic actually. And our mission has always been we want to create a platform and app to drive behavior change. But our initial thought how to do this was we thought of individuals. And we thought, okay, we create an app, we have social media channels, we have partners, we have networks, and we just blast it out there. And then, like people will come and follow and do these different activities. And I think actually we had moderate success with it. But when we looked at who are the people who are following our Instagram, who are the people who are downloading the app, actually we realized they are all people who already converted, they already see the point, they already like sustainability, that's why they like us, right? Like how the light attracts the flies. And we were like, but this is not the audience that we primarily want to focus on, we want to go beyond that. And so we completely switched our thinking and said, instead of us trying to attract a community around us, like a magnet, can we insert ourselves into existing communities and do it that way? And this has proven to be, till now, the better way for us forward. So we started working with corporates, doing employee engagement programs. We started working with event organizers. For example, it's the second year now we are working with the iLight Festival, where it's like a public event where the people are already there, the community is there, but we are basically plugging sustainability into it. And with the EcoFund now, we are looking at going into schools. So I would say our learning was really, instead of trying to solve a problem and then gather a crowd, maybe try more towards looking at existing communities and plugging yourself into that, because that makes it easier and it speeds up the process, and oftentimes it's also much more impactful in terms of reaching the right people.
Great points. And to Carolin's point, that's why later on when you guys break out into your activities, the first activity you're going to do is to define your community, right? To get to, I think what all of you have uniformly shared is the idea that you have to make sustainability relevant and relatable to your audience. And each audience is going to approach sustainability differently. Or their drivers for why they want to do something in sustainability will be very different. And it's important to be aware of that and to tailor your messaging and your activities accordingly. And I think Jayden also shared about timing being very important, and I cannot agree with her more. As someone who oversees a lot of SG EcoFund projects, we oftentimes see a lot of our grantees have to shift their timings, either because there are delays or the partners' timelines just don't line up. So it's always important to sync up with your partners, make sure that the timing works for everyone, but also think about what activities and events are happening around you, and how can you leverage on that buzz or that action that's already happening within the space to encourage more excitement, so you can drive more traffic and attention towards what you're doing. Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure something is successful. The visibility piece is quite important. Yeah. And then the bandwidth of your stakeholders was another, I think, very important thing, right? Is thinking like, of course, for all of you, you don't do sustainability full time. So we cannot expect that everybody's going to have 8 hours in a day to work on these things. So what is a realistic ask that you can make of the communities that you work with? So that you can lower the barriers to entry for people who are new to sustainability. So all great points. And so I want to pivot slightly, now that we've talked a bit about challenges, talking about how do we measure success? What does success look like for each of your projects? And how did you think about or design the impact measurement or going about measuring that success within your project? So 2 parts. What is success for your project look like, and how do you go about measuring it within the context of the project?
I think it's my turn to start first. Yeah. Okay. So So I went to education school before I did all of this. So success for me is not just numbers, yeah? It's how people feel in their hearts and minds. I could sit in the classroom and talk to students all day, and I'll just know that my little birdling, like birds became like, they're soaring and everything. So I have that soft side of me. I believe when people do anything that I establish, I hope that by the end I'll have conversations with each of them that show how to grow. That's the soft side answer. The hard side answer is statistics. So for us, when we reduce textile waste, we look at the latest data about textile waste available in Singapore. In our case, in 2016 is the latest data, and that's when we found out 34 items of clothing were bought per year on average, and 27 were discarded on average. What we do when we propose to the Eco Fund is we have a goal. We say, hey, the people who come, watch our film, and go through our screening experience, which Eco Fund pays for, they will have the amount of clothing that they buy. So in this case, instead of buying 34 new items of clothing a year, they'll buy 17 when they start hanging out with us. And so then we go 17 times 400 people, because that's the amount of people we expect, equals 6,800 garments that will not be bought because people start hanging out with us. That's essentially how we do it. Yeah.
Thank you for the nomination. Yeah. Yeah, so for us, right, what defines success or impact? I mean, of course, like in our whole grant application, we talk about, you know, the number of families reached and also like how much food waste we collect. But these are actually short-term impacts. But when I would like to tackle that question in terms of a long-term impact. So I mentioned earlier that we're actually working with like the community center and also grassroots leaders. So like people who are in the residential communities. So what I really hope on behalf of the startup is that, you know, how can we actually work on this collaboration with the grassroots, with the community center, to actually run very meaningful workshops that can be scaled across to different neighborhoods. Because I mean, just one project and one community, if I stop there, then okay, and call it the end of the day, then that's the max that I can achieve. But if I can actually come up with a home working model that is sustainable as a startup, because we also, our livelihood also depends on this composting. So if we can come up with a sustainable model and scale it to different community centers or even schools or even corporates, then it would really be very helpful to kind of create a movement. Yeah, and also I think, the data that we collect, actually, I think that would be very important. So besides like, how will the workshops actually go? How involved are the participants? Do they actually continue composting? And if they can actually share data with us and say that, hey, we actually attended your composting workshop, and every month we actually convert around like 10 kg of our waste into compost. Then with that data, right, then I can share with Ethan and his team, and then we can see how then, as a nation, could there be more support? I mean, beyond just food waste, but textile waste and all this, how can we actually create this kind of incentive models? Because it's a carrot and stick world, right? Like, you don't have any incentive. Sometimes it's very hard to kickstart, to break through the inertia, to do the first positive behavior. So just to give an example also, like I know other cities in the world, like Brussels, they actually give like compost bin grants to residents. Yeah, so that actually helps. And also I think I don't know where else, they provide chickens for households to actually eat their food waste and then produce eggs. I'm quite sure somewhere in Europe, I cannot exactly remember where. So I think it's really the coordination between government and also enterprise. How can we actually work hand in hand? Yeah, so as an enterprise, as a startup, if we can actually leverage on some of this grant and then do this kind of small scale pilot project and to show that actually there's like good impact, then we can bring it to them and be like, how can we scale it, right? But without the first project that shows results, it's very hard to tell them, okay, I think this is what we need to do. And then they will say, hey, maybe it's not realistic, right? But if you show that it's possible, and of course, not just in one aspect of like food waste, also community engagement, like how empowered are they, how much more aware and more active they are after the whole program will be really helpful as well, to track.
Okay, so Jayden's answer reminded me, I forgot to tell you how I actually track how many items of clothing people buy. So our movie and screening experience is happening at the projector in September. At the end of the screening, what we do is we hand out a wear counter, which I wanted to tell you about because it is not anything technologically fancy. It's literally a chart with an x-axis and a y-axis. Yeah? And there's two things. So the x-axis tracks let's start with the y-axis. The y-axis tracks the amount of clothes people buy, and it only goes up to 17. And we force them there because it's half of 34, that's our goal. And then the x-axis goes up to 30 because we're trying to encourage people to wear something 30 times. Because the average amount of times they wear something now is like 7 before they throw it away, yeah? So for us, we've got the x and y axis going on, and I wanted to share that part with you because I think it's important to know that SG Ecomon people are not looking for you guys to come up with fancy apps. Yeah, you can literally just come up with an x and y axis chart. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
But if you have an app, it's also cool. Okay.
No, don't do that. Jokes aside, actually, I think I can just summarize a lot of the points that you have already mentioned. But for us, we also looked at both qualitative and quantitative data. And in terms of the quantitative box, that we opened that box, I think two key metrics are, first of all, the engagement, and another one is the impact. And I think engagement is extremely, extremely important because we are living in a world where this is not a given. It's like we have so much information, we have so many apps out there, we have so much tools, and there's so much buzz and hassle about us. We are not focused anymore, and actually getting somebody or a community to come together to engage about your cause is extremely, extremely hard, and I'm happy to share more about that. And so I think the first one is to really measure how many people can we reach. And so for us, as we are an app, we are looking at how many people we reached out to, how many of these people downloaded the app, how many of them accredited an account, how many of them actively engaged, and then actively engaged over the whole campaign period, for example. And it doesn't end actually there, so then what we are even more interested in, which is almost linking to the qualitative data, is also how we retain them. And if the incentives go away or the rewards are smaller, will you still continue doing the same things over the job? And how many people can we bring over? So this is the engagement part, and then in terms of the impact part, also trying to quantify, in our case, we talked about these mini micro actions and tasks. What do they translate into? So let's say one of the activities is I want students to bring a reusable lunch container instead of getting a single-use one. Then I could actually, or data, some research that says the average weight of a single-use plastic container is 17 grams. And so I could assume that if I save a certain amount of, I get people to do a certain amount of BYOs, then that's how much maybe plastic containers I could save. Similar to the metrics that you're using for clothes, right? And then for some others, it's getting a little bit more complex. And oftentimes, people will always ask me, oh, can we calculate the carbon? What's the carbon savings? But actually, if you go down this route, it's very complicated because there's a lot of assumptions that you have to make in order to get the numbers right. And in the end, what you end up is just a number, and you tell the number, and nobody even knows what the number means. And so I always encourage people to say, like, let's not try to only look in carbon, but find other metrics to measure. So something that's also tangible in people's minds, what does it mean? So instead of, for example, we have also one of the rewards that we give is that you can plant a tree, and so it's easier to say, I planted 300 trees instead of saying for every tree over the growth life they sequestered 308 kilos of carbon. So I think also in the measurement, just like looking at what is the outcome that you want to communicate, and then looking at the qualitative side quickly, also really trying to not only look at the data, but look at the individuals, at the people behind, and especially when the objective is to drive behavior change. You can only find it out from the individuals who participated, and you can try maybe to surveying or to interviewing them to find out how did they really, what has changed, right? What habits were they adopting previously? How through this campaign they are now, what new habits they have learned? How do they feel about this? How likely are they going to continue? And I think there's like a lot of learning in this as well. And then maybe just one last sentence to sum this up. I think what you guys already shared is that a lot of the data that we are gathering is really not only for the purpose of the project itself, but really trying to see what general, how to say, knowledge can we get out of it, and what kind of pattern can we see, and how this in the bigger picture can be interesting for other projects and can benefit others beyond our own project in the big run, in the long run. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So to summarize, again, amazing points. Couldn't have. I don't think you guys say it better than I do. So there's, of course, when you do impact measurement, there's two sides. There's always the qualitative and the quantitative. I think when we want to think about action, it's always easier to do quantitative. But sometimes when you're dealing with environment stuff, because a lot of it tends to be consumption related, sometimes you're looking at what you're saving, right? So I think both Carolin and Thammika have talked about how you can look at, if you're talking about waste related topics, you could be looking at waste that's been avoided as a result of certain actions that have been taken. As Carolin rightfully pointed out, I would not suggest doing carbon accounting unless you are very familiar with it or have experience with it, because it can be very complex. And EcoFund does not require you to set carbon emissions targets as part of your project. It's a community project, we can keep the metrics simple. In terms of tracking, there are different ways to go about tracking it. I think Thammika shared about how she's using a very simple where counter that's basically just a table to get people to actually track. But the most important thing is actually getting people to report is actually the difficult part, right? And so sometimes an app has some benefit over that, because once you can measure the clicks that people do. So as you think about your project, also think about how you're going to measure what are those actions that people are taking. Is there some way that you can build into your project to do that, either through check-ins or through some measurement tool or some simple way that you can, do a poll or a survey periodically to figure out whether people are actually following or doing what you are hoping they will do. And then the longer term impact, which I'm really glad you guys brought up, is equally important to think about. I know for some of you, you're just starting out on your project ideas, you may not have, you're like, oh, I don't know where this is going to go, and that's okay. EcoFund, we don't penalize if you don't have a long-term plan or strategy, but it's important to think about where you want to start and where it can go. It doesn't need to be the end goal, but good to think about. So let's say for some of you, I think you work with communities, say you run several senior centers or several community centers or student activity centers, and maybe you just want to pilot and start in one first, and then eventually you take the learnings that you get from that one place and then expand it to other places. I definitely think that's a much more sustainable model than trying to do it at scale from the get-go. And EcoFund, we recommend starting out with pilots. So don't feel like you need to do something big from the get-go. Start small, ideate, iterate, figure out what works, what doesn't work with your target audience, and then you take those learnings to be able to scale up to something bigger. And I think all of them have had experience and have done that in some shape or form. I'm going to wrap up soon, but I also want to open it up to the floor. Now it's your turn. If you have any questions for our audience members, or you're just curious to hear more about what they did in their particular project. Anyone? Any takers?
Can I ask you a question? A poll question.
Maybe start with one first. Then we see how much time we have, because I also want to give time to...
Start with you first then. I saw your first slide, you say that should not be receiving funding from other government agencies. I need some qualification. What do you mean? Let's say, for example, we do get grants for a program, like because of counseling center, by way of ticket from Ojai, you can see Ojai on the t-shirt. So does that mean that I cannot apply for EcoFund? Yes or no?
Okay, so for fund-related questions, I would suggest we take it after the session. I will be around the whole afternoon, so you all can talk to me about it, but I will answer this one since you've raised it, just for the benefit of everybody. If you are receiving funding from other government sources, that's not, so for EcoFund, we function on a project basis, meaning that we look at the project you send to us and say, is this particular project getting funding from another government agency? If your organization is getting funding as for overheads or your organizational capacity, that's okay, because that's not tied to the specific project that you're working on. But if the specific project that you're working on, you also submitted it to some other government agency for funding, then we cannot accept that because it will be double counting funding. Yeah. Were there any other questions that were related to the panel?
Sure. Okay.
Okay. maybe one more first.
One more.
Yeah, then I will open up to
Okay.
others also first.
Okay.
Then I come back to you.
Correct. Because you're using an app, so we work a lot with seniors. So I'm wondering whether your apps is language-based or something like that. Because talking about gamification, which we're also using. So I'm not sure that app, how do you design it? Maybe for younger people or disabled older people?
Very good question. So actually it's also for us has been an evolution. Initially when we started, I think we kind of segmented the target audience more as like young professionals, maybe students in their late 20s or early 20s until maybe the late 30s or so. And we basically had a very, narrowed perspective of who are going to be our users. And then as we have actually evolved, we have seen actually we need to be much more inclusive. We need to be thinking about many more groups in our society and see how can we do this. Of course, there is limitations to that because also when you look at LD, I'm just thinking now about my maybe in-laws, right? It's even very hard for them to use WhatsApp or whatever. And for that reason also, I don't think that they will be really the audience for the app that we have created. So there's some limitations. But what we can do is actually in the messaging, in the design, maybe also in the UX, how you can, for example, change the font size and all of it, make it more inclusive. And so those are the considerations that we have definitely taken and try to see how within the UX we can be better at inclusiveness, but we have to be very realistic. There is always a certain part of the community that we cannot reach just because of that technology and maybe their ability to interact with apps in the first place.
Hi, I'm Tracy from AWA. So more than half of our beneficiaries are people with disability, right? So we are talking about inclusion here. How do we actually put that into this eco-funding project that we can have for our our students with disabilities in our schools, as well as also adult disability, those who are in our adult disability center. So we are looking at projects that is exploring this avenue. So do you have any comments on that at the moment?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you're here because I personally am a big believer of inclusive movement for sustainability, and I think people with disabilities is one group that's often left out of the conversation. And we did a session with MEPC just a month ago on creating more connections across these different communities. So thank you for coming, and I really hope you come up with a project that we can support of this, several projects. So to your question, there are, I think, a lot of different intersections, and I also am very curious to hear what our panelists think. But off the top of our head, what we've seen from some of our past grant recipients is sustainability is actually, they see it from a green economy perspective. There are a lot of employment opportunities for people with disabilities in the sustainability field as it relates to urban agriculture, in like urban farming, but even when you talk about waste upcycling, because some of the processes that you do as part of the waste upcycling process are very simple actions but very repetitive and labor intensive, such as like when you need to shred plastic. So these are activities that people with disabilities can do also. So I think there's lots of opportunities for them to be actively engaged in that process. We want to also open it up to the rest. We have seen other models for that.
I'm very pensive right now. So I don't know if you were there. I worked with Ewa a few months ago. I was with Will and Well. We were working with Ewa to figure out how school uniforms can be adapted to fit students' needs. I don't think you were at that workshop, okay. I say that specifically because I think when I heard that question, the first part of me thought, well, disability is one word, but the reality is so much more complex and nuanced. So already when I knew I had to or wanted to answer that question, I realized I needed to ask you, well, what kind of disability, and more questions. So I think how I would answer your question most responsibly is by saying the only way I can answer your question responsibly is by having a conversation with you, because it is my responsibility to do that.
Sure. Happy to have that conversation.
Okay. And I also think that I've actively looked to work with people with disabilities when I hire. And that's because I don't think people with disabilities, for any reason at all, should not be a part of whatever I'm thinking. So I guess I'm answering that also by saying that I think myself and me knowing the other panelists here a bit, we're welcome and humbled by the ability to work with people from Iwa, really, because I think that when we talk about environmental issues or climate change, we are talking about so many risks to their lives that we as a society do not plan for. Flash floods, for instance, are something that people in wheelchairs will not get out of on their own, and we as a society do not prepare for that, for instance. So there's so many conversations to be had, and I think the onus is almost not on you, but it's on us to do the work of having a conversation with you. Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? That was tough, but real.
So Thamika's point also made me think about, and I think what today's exercise will hopefully spark is to also think about, when people with disabilities, as they go through their lives, how are they interacting with sustainability, and where is there opportunities for them to change their actions too? Because I don't think that they are any different from us. They are also people that have to consume as part of their daily life. And what are some of those behaviors that need to be changed, or certain things? So say for example, we talk about sometimes certain people with disabilities, they need a straw to drink their drinks, to drink liquids. And the sustainability movement, typically we have this no straw policy, right? But that's not very in line with the inclusive movement where straws are needed. So to me, that's an opportunity of how do we marry those two pieces together. And that's an example of how can we look at these individual things and make it more sustainable for every community as well. Yeah. So I think we can interrogate them more later. But great question. One more question before we close. Anybody else?
I actually got one. But, what's the organizers? Only if no one else has a question.
I know you had some more, right?
But he had a question.
Okay, Ken.
Yeah. Sorry for stealing that, I guess. Just maybe a two-parter. I think the first one, of course, in an ideal world, I come up. A good situation is, as a representative from our various organizations, I come up with an initiative that I can then put in for the Eco Fund. I'm just wondering if there's a scenario where it is a more type of partner-driven type of thing. If I find that I do not have the resources to launch this by myself, is there a partnership situation that I can explore? And I think the second part to that is, what can I do to be a good partner, or like not do, that kind kind of thing. Yeah. Just,
I'll take the first part, and then you all can take the second part. I mean, you guys have a lot of partners in your projects, so you can probably speak more to that. So the first part on, yeah, if you don't have the bandwidth to do the application yourself, I think it's important to also think of, and thank you, Daniel, for asking that question on partnership, because EcoFund runs on a reimbursement basis, right? Which means that typically the organization that puts in the application has to front the cost first. And that's an important consideration to keep in mind operationally, whether you have the cash flow. And realistically, we come across situations where certain grantees don't have, or like in the application process, it surfaces that that particular applicant actually doesn't have the cash flow to actually run the project first and then get reimbursed. Our reimbursements are in tranches, so it's not like you have to wait till the whole project is completed to get reimbursed, but still, like you need some capital to start, right? And I think that's where sometimes working with a partner helps, figuring out who is the right organization to front the application, and because we also don't pay for like manpower, for example, and you know some of our EcoFund grantees here, they are also vendors for other projects, because for their own EcoFund project, we can't pay them for their time. We're not allowed to. But if they are a vendor for somebody else, then they can be paid as a professional service as part of another person's project. So I share these modalities to just get you thinking, and when you do eventually submit your EcoFund application, as to whether you want to be the lead applicant, whether you want to work with another organization, those are all possibilities. And if you feel constrained and not able to work with that reimbursement model, come and talk to us. We can, help you with that process to figure out how to make it work, how to package the application, and who can do that. And we have our own array of partners that we try to bring in to address this barrier that is reimbursement. Because we understand that reimbursement does present certain limitations. So I'll hand over to them to talk about what makes a good partner.
Actually, I wanted to just comment on the earlier part a little bit as well, in terms of maybe there's so many different fund grantees out there, and so talking in our position, actually, we really see ourselves as a tool that can be used in so many different contexts. And in a way, we are looking always for communities that want to engage with us, and they want to use, for example, the Susgain app in order to try out reaching to fulfilling different objectives. So, for example, as an example, for the SG EcoFund, we applied, we found schools who want to work with us, and then basically Susgain is, I would say, the grant applicant who's kind of managing the whole project. And then as part of this project, we got a lot of other ecosystem partners actually to come into the boat to support what we are trying to do. And then as this model that Ethan just mentioned, we actually reimburse them. And it actually turns out that some of them are also other EcoFund grantees. And so, for example, we have at one of the schools a market day, and they're going to be different clothes, fashion upcycling, book swap, workshops to design thinking on reused cooking oil, and those kind of plastic upcycling. And these partners are actually also sometimes grantees themselves. But through us being able to manage the EcoFund, we can then actually compensate them for the services they provide. And then vice versa, we also see that actually sometimes communities come to us. So we had a lot of schools reaching out to us and saying, hey, we saw that you're doing something with schools. We would love to do the same for our community, but where can we get funding? Or just last week I was invited to speak at the Northwest SCC on a sustainability forum, and they asked, hey, we want to do this for our neighborhood, we want to do this for our community. How can we get support? And so then again, the EcoFund, I feel, is like a perfect answer to this. So because obviously when we're going to put in effort to roll out a project, we need to, be sustainable ourselves, and we need to be funded by something. And I think that's then where I would again direct these schools to the EcoFund and say, hey, this is the opportunity, or this is the avenue for you to explore.
I'm just going to list an example of how I worked with another eco-fund grantee. So basically, recently we ran a home composting with mushroom waste workshop. So basically, we worked together with the grantee, Golden Cap Farm. They actually produce mushroom, and they have all these spent bags of still very, I would say, nutritious. Kind of like there's wood, there's some like grains and all that. So basically, usually what these farms do is sometimes they throw away or they try to donate it. But basically, by combining these two kind of like startups together, then we actually launched a workshop that is more appealing to the audience actually. So I think it's important to find synergies within the cohort, or even I think there's so many cohorts of SG Eco Fund recipients. I think it's good to actually work together sometimes.
Yeah.
Up to you. You don't have to.
So for me, I purposely work with people outside of EcoFund, but I think that just goes back to me wanting to branch out to new communities.
So, I mean, just to summarize, yes, work with people. If you have all of our grant recipients are available on our website. There's a whole list, and you can, browse through that list. You see any interesting projects that you would love to bring to your communities, feel free to reach out to us. Our email is also available, sg_eco_fund@nsc.gov.sg. It will be available later. And we are very happy to connect you to these people as well. Yeah. So don't feel like you have to do this by yourself as an organization. Always find advocates, talk to people and find out people who have already been doing this work to see what you can adapt for your own community. On that note, I want to close, but maybe just to summarize, one final point, what's maybe either words of encouragement or something you wish you knew when you were first starting out a project. Just one sentence, Anyone want to go first?
One sentence.
I just want to challenge everyone to be super creative and really look at the existing projects and the past projects and think about how you can even branch out even further than what we have already done, because there's actually sometimes pretty similar projects but in different places. So get creative and explore intersections. Sorry, very long sentence.
I think sometimes I've been sitting on the other side and listening to panelists and so on, and then it always sounds very intimidating, like, oh, they already got the grant, oh, they have already done this, right? And actually, I encourage you, if we can do this, you can do this 10,000 times. So please, just go for it, just try it out. Everything is possible, so just believe in yourself and believe in your ideas, so anybody can do it. So there's no difference between, any of us. We are all same.
Do a lot of research.
Great, thank you so much. Big round of applause to our